Previously on Ty's Hot Mess History. Stay tuned for Part 2, in which we will discuss the less violent version of African Dodger, Drop the Chocolate Drop, as well as a backlash against black men who chose to play the Dodger. The backlash came from other black men. We'll also look a little more deeply into how some children were exposed to African Dodger beyond the home game edition. The first mention that I could find of the less violent version of the game was in 1911, when the Washington Herald published an article about an amusement park in Chicago, which featured a new version called Drop the Chocolate Drop. Now, while the game had become less brutal than its predecessor, it was still equally demeaning. When the Herald's story went out, it was called Human Dummies. Quote, "The drop of chocolate in this case is of the African persuasion. Above a tank of water, upon a trap door, sits a jolly colored man. Connected with the trap at one side is a flat target, about the size of a dinner plate. The trick is to see if you can hit the target with a thrown ball. The hit trips the trap door, tumbling the chocolate drop into the water. The water does him good, to be sure, and being paid well for his dummy service, he seems to enjoy the fun. There are two such traps side by side, so that when one victim is scrambling around and trying to get out of his water tank, another is in position and waiting for his turn to be tumbled. A continuous performance." End quote. Now, the jolly colored man isn't the only dummy in this story, or rather, both jolly colored men side by side, getting ready to be tumbled into tanks. The other dummies were Japanese men who were chess pieces on a colossal chessboard, told to move by the players who controlled them. The games could last as long as 3 days. But just because Drop the Chocolate Drop was the new game in Chicago, that didn't mean that the rest of the nation had followed suit just yet. Chicago was ahead of the times. 6 years later, in 1917, the New York Age published a story about proposing an anti-African Dodger bill for consideration in the state of New York. The New York Age was one of the most prominent black newspapers of its time, and many of its readers felt so strongly in support of the proposed legislation that they were compelled to write letters to the editor. One of those letters was from a reader named Ernest G. Hebbins, and he wrote, quote, "I, too, have been thoroughly disgusted with that phase of Negro employment. Personally, I have never been to Coney Island, and had no idea that they had such there. Since that is a fact, judging from the number of our people that frequent that popular resort, it must indeed be a constant menace to the great mass of Negroes. I have only seen it in and around the New York at Palisade Park, on the Hudson. I once lived within a few blocks of that park, and it was a constant pleasure for me to run down there every once in a while until I saw this much-discussed African Dodger. A great sense of shame came over me as I saw the many persons taking chances at his head. Before I would submit to such an indignity or take advantage of such an act to demonstrate my pitching ability, I would cast my every nickel in the nearby natatorium." End quote. Many readers of the New York Age wrote in to express their second-hand embarrassment regarding the black men who chose this line of work. Even though it was 1917, there was other work available, which was clearly expressed in the letters written to the publication. Though taking up the role of the Dodger was almost exclusively done by black males, there were exceptions, and I'm not referring to the monkeys who had no choice. In 1922, the Democrat and Chronicle wrote 2 stories about a little black girl who played the role of an African Dodger. The first story was published on May 13th, and the second on May 14th. On Friday, May 12th, the First Methodist Church was having a carnival. The church's carnival had an African Dodger booth. A little black girl walked onto the grounds and offered to play the Dodger, and the game went on just the same as if she had been a man. The church used rubber balls as the projectile for her to dodge. White children, women, and men paid to get their chance to hit her, until a white police officer showed up to check out the holy Christian carnival. When he saw the Dodger booth, he shut it down. End of story. Until the 14th, when the Reverend himself made a statement to defend his church's disgusting attraction. Quote, Reverend Herbert G. Bergstaller, pastor of the First Methodist Church, North Fitz High Street, characterized the so-called African Dodger game that was closed by a policeman at the Epworth League Carnival on Friday evening at the church as an innocent, wholesome game, and said that the suppression was due to the efforts of certain interests in Rochester that are out to muzzle the churches. Mr. Bergstaller said the game that received police attention offered no danger at all to the young girl who took the part of the Dodger. Soft rubber balls were thrown, and the carnival was mainly for children. It is not customary for detectives to go to church carnivals in search of evil, which I am sure is more likely to be found and could be found in other places in Rochester, said Reverend Bergstaller. The animosity which actuated this action is thoroughly understood. He promised that he would have something to say on gambling and other law-breaking in his sermon this evening. End quote. And yes, this story was printed on a Sunday. So, according to the good old Reverend, African Dodger was nothing more than good, wholesome Christian family fun. Mainly kids were throwing balls. Just a few men. No real harm. After all, everybody was just throwing soft rubber balls. Well, putting aside the fact that a rubber ball hitting your face can still be very dangerous, another thing about African Dodger is that sometimes the players would bring their own balls to play the game, and they were often hard metal balls. But as far as this reverend was concerned, stop harassing the church from spreading the gospel and go find some real criminals. You know, like gamblers. I'll be preaching about them tonight. Drop by and listen and bring a little something to put into the collection plate. Anyone who would allow children to participate as an African Dodger was morally reprehensible. Whether it was a carnival owner or manager, parents looking for a little extra money, or a reverend of all people. But there was another way that children were exposed to African Dodger. For those who had never played the part of an African Dodger or seen an African Dodger stall at a carnival or an amusement park, there were cartoons. Donald Duck was pictured in a cartoon strip buying his 3 African Dodger balls for 5 cents. And when Bluto failed to impress Olive Oil with his African Dodger throwing skills, Popeye came to the booth and put him to shame. He used every ball in the stall, and each one hit the target flawlessly and effortlessly. African Dodger is a part of American history. It never went away. It just evolved. And when it became the drop the chocolate drop version, everybody got in on it. Dunk tanks at carnivals, amusement parks, and fairs featuring white adults and even children was not an uncommon thing to see. I even recall seeing an episode of Little House on the Prairie where Laura and her arch nemesis, Nellie Olson, were the sitting targets of a dunk tank. And yes, with the dunk tank, there was a humiliation factor involved, but it wasn't inherently harmful or racial. White men dressed as clowns or even children who were raising money for their schools would play the dummy in these setups. But even decades after the 1930s, African Dodger existed in some parts of the country in its original form, and under its more offensive names. And in the states that insisted on the game being racially degrading, even after black men finally stopped volunteering to be the Dodger, the target became a mechanical wooden African figurine with exaggerated features, like very large eyes and lips and extremely wide noses. In many cities across the country, the chocolate drop exhibit didn't go away until after the height of the civil rights movement, and even then, that wasn't due to any legislation. It was the result of enough people getting around to thinking that the attraction was in poor taste. The African Dodger game was an example of racial inhumanity, even though some Black people were willing participants. But there was another example of racial mistreatment that Black people imposed upon each other based on skin complexion. This is discussed at length in my video about the Blue Vein Society, which consisted of people who were Black and partially Black who saw themselves as inferior to white people, but superior to people who presented as fully Black with darker skin. You can see that video here. I will leave a link to it in the description box. My sources for this story are the Indiana Herald Archives, 1881, Sun Journal Archives, 1884 and 1885, the World Archives, 1893, Buffalo Courier Express Archives, 1903, the Washington Herald Archives, 1911, the New York Age Archives, 1917, Democrat and Chronicle Archives, 1922, and Poughkeepsie Eagle News Archives, 1935. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the hot mess history. The link is in the description box.